This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Politico's UK Financial Services Summit. I'm Jamil Andolini. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Politico in Europe, based in Brussels, that very exciting financial centre of Brussels. This is actually the first full summit that Politico has done here in the UK. I'm very excited personally that it's a finance summit. I've spent my entire career covering finance as a journalist, and I believe very strongly that we're in the age of politicization of everything. If you think about the period after the end of the Cold War, from the early 1990s till about 5 or 8 years ago or so, that was really the age of globalization, of financialization, of the GDPization of everything. So you could be a dictator in Moscow, or an investment banker in New York, or a dentist in Switzerland, and it wasn't really about the politics so much as it was about the economics, the finance, the GDP. Today, everything is about politics, and that is what we at Politico do best. I believe very strongly that no other publication in the world is as well placed to cover that intersection of finance and politics, policy making and the economy. And that's why I joined Politico a couple of years ago, one of the reasons. And that's why I believe we are extremely well placed for the current era of covering the financial world, and that's also why we're very excited that in early 2024 we will be launching a brand new area of coverage which will focus specifically on the UK financial policy making and regulatory world. So to get a free month, 1 month free trial for that new coverage, you can scan the QR codes you'll find on the live stream, or right there. And if you scan that, and they'll be around for the rest of the summit, if you scan that, you will be signed up for 1 month's free trial for this new area of coverage, which will be adding on to our existing coverage in Brussels of EU finance legislation and policy making, as well as our brilliant central banker coverage, focusing on the ECB and central banking and Bank of England, which we launched earlier this year. You can also, you will see around today several of our Politico Pro colleagues who are around, so look out for those if you want to know more about that. Before we kick off the full summit, I'd really like to thank our partners who made this event possible. Our leading partner is Nationwide, and our presenting partners are ARKIT and MFA. I have to have the pleasure of giving you a few housekeeping rules. You can ask questions through the swap card platform. If you're in the room, you can scan the QR code there on the screens. Otherwise, you can check instructions on our event website. If you're already on the platform, you feel free to chat with fellow attendees, ask questions in the questions box to the right of the screen on a desktop and below the live stream if you're looking at this, watching this on your mobile. We at Politico very much encourage and believe in free and open debate. So please talk about us on X, on what used to be known as Twitter, or other social media of your choice. We encourage you to live tweet using @LivePolitico, live tweet @LivePolitico using hashtag #PoliticoFinance. And now we're going to head into our very first session of the day, looking at the state of the UK economy. I'm very pleased to invite our central banking editor, Geoffrey Smith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panellists would like to join me. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to see you all. Over at the Wyndham Theatre, we have Kenneth Branagh running through King Lear in 2 hours flat, but we are going to go one better, and we're going to nail the problems of the British economy in 40 minutes. And needless to say, we won't be having an interval either, so well done all those of you who brought your drinks in. Joining me today, or rather, let us stay where we are. What is our theme? Our theme is the UK economy. Where are we now? Well, I think most of us have a pretty good idea. We'll all have our own idea of where we are. A decade of shocks, great financial crisis, Brexit, the pandemic, Ukraine war have left us poorer. As a nation, we haven't had a pay rise in over a decade. So that's where we are now. So where we are now is perhaps only half the question. And the other half of the question is, of course, how do we get from there to where we want to be? Well, joining me to give us the answers to those questions, on my left, Bim Afalami, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Hitchin and Harpenden and a member of the Business and Trade Committee. He's served as Parliamentary Private Secretary at both the Department of Trade and the Department of Work and Pensions, two vital cogs of the UK economy since joining Parliament in 2017. He's also the author of a 2020 pamphlet entitled Unlocking Britain, which is a manifesto for a post-pandemic recovery, which is still, I think, in the works. On the far left, if only in a topographic sense, we have James Murray, the MP for Ealing North, and for the last 3 years, Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Now, before that, he was London's Deputy Mayor for Housing. And 2 months ago, you may have seen, James was busy telling the Labour Party Conference Fringe event that wealth creation had to go before wealth redistribution. Now, that is a line that perhaps hasn't always been heard from his party over the last decade, but I imagine he will give us more in chapter and verse on that in the next 40 minutes. Between them, we have the third member of our panel, Shankar Singham, who perhaps needs a little introduction in these circles. He's a fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Chief Executive of Competitory, Trade and Competition Policy Consultancy. Champion of free trade, he's also co-chairman of the Growth Commission set up by Liz Truss. And his commission will be front-running the Chancellor outrageously next week with his proposals on how to get us going. Now, I'm going to give each of our members a minute to identify what the key issues for them are, and then we'll take it from there into a more general discussion. I hope you have your questions ready. We'll be saving some time for them at the end. Bim Afalami.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Look, there are so many things that we can improve about the British economy, and and I'm sure all the panelists will have their thoughts on that. One area that I ask you to think about is our regulatory system. I'm chairman of something called the Regulatory Reform Group. One of the things that we're trying to do is to move away from an approach of thinking about regulation as, it's just about there's too much, or maybe there's too little in some areas, or we need to deregulate or slash and burn, or all of these debates that we've had in the past. We need to think of the entire system and think why it is that we have got a system that increasingly doesn't work for anybody. We have more and more rules that are harder and harder to understand and harder to follow, and this inhibits economic growth. Now, I think that this comes out of a culture, a broader societal political culture that is seeking to eliminate all risk from society, all risk from the economy, all risk from how we operate. And when you do that too much, when the balance goes too much in one direction, you strangle all risk, which means you strangle innovation and growth at the same time. So I think that we need to look at our regulatory system in quite a fundamental way. There are all sorts of other things as well, but I think that is one thing, doesn't cost the Treasury any money. It is one area where we can really improve the productivity and growth of our country and improve the innovation in our society as well.
Thank you very much. Very succinct. James?
Oh,
thanks very much for having me along here today. And when I think about the UK economy, I think the truth is that we've had a decade or just over a decade of low growth in the British economy. And actually, the one thing that we actually thought that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng got right last year was to say that we have been stuck in a vicious cycle of stagnation. The difference between myself and I suspect some of the other panelists here is what the response is to that analysis of the problem. And from our point of view, we know we need to get economic growth up to a much better level than it has been in recent years. One of the things that I made clear at party conference, in the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, was that when we're thinking about what the solution is to some of the challenges that we face, we don't see it as being, we in the Labour Party do not see it as being to pull the tax and spend lever, it's to pull the growth lever. Because getting the economy growing is the way to make people across the country better off, to make sure public services are sustainable, and to make sure that all parts of the UK are in a better position. So that's why for us, we keep talking about our plan for growth, because we think it's so essential to talk about it. I've realised I've got a minute, so I probably haven't got time to go through all of that now. But hopefully during the discussion we have, I can set out more about our plan for growth, which we think the British economy needs.
We will indeed come back to you for that. Shankar, we chatted about this before, and we agreed, I think, that a lot of these questions are problems that affect the broader advanced economies in general. What is specifically British about the problems we face?
Yes, so I think just to put the UK in context, what we have actually seen over the last, even beyond 10 years, but back really sort of 25 years, is fairly stagnant growth in the whole G7, so particularly Western Europe and Japan and the UK. The US has been a little bit more resilient, a little bit more robust, but not a massive amount, to be honest. But even within that, we've started to lag GDP per capita of countries like the US. So for example, around that time period, GDP per capita of the UK and the US were not that dissimilar. Now the US is about 80% GDP per capita bigger than the UK. So this is a real problem. This is fundamentally affecting people's quality of life and living standards. And now within that, the UK has some specific problems, we think. And I would say that in terms of what we can do from here, there's basically three things that we focus on in the Growth Commission. One is tax policy, fiscal policy, and regulatory reform. And echoing what Bim was saying about regulatory reform, I think historically Treasury departments around the world have basically said, well, tax and fiscal policy is what really moves the needle. Regulatory, particularly for a developed country, is a sort of optional extra. Our models are showing actually that that's not the case, and in fact regulatory reform is a bigger mover in terms of GDP per capita than, there are things you need to do in tax and fiscal policy obviously, but don't neglect regulatory reform because it is actually a bigger driver of GDP per capita growth than just focusing on tax and fiscal. It hasn't had the emphasis, and it is really about, we look at regulatory reform across three dimensions. What is the effect of your regulatory system on your trade openness? If it distorts your trade openness, it's going to drive down GDP per capita. What's its effect on competition in the market? That's going to drive down GDP per capita. And what's its effect on property rights protection? And we look at those three dimensions, and what we're finding is actually the improvements possible in regulatory reform are very significant GDP per capita numbers.
Thanks. Ben, if I can pick you up there on the point that you made, that our regulations are ultimately the result of our governments, and our governments are ultimately the result of our electorates. They are the product of our electorates. The high state of regulation we have, this thicket of regulation that we have across the economy today, is it not a result, an inevitable result of a society that has become older and more conservative, less risk averse in its ways? Because if that is the case, then how do we escape a situation where that is reinforced in future because the population aging problem is not going away, it is simply getting worse?
Look, it's an interesting point. I think there are two aspects I pick up on, right? So the first is that there is, if only our regulations were actually the product of what elected politicians transmitted to government departments and then what happened in the regulators. I look across the room and see people involved, for example, in financial services. They would have had conversations in public and mostly in private about where politicians are completely aghast at what regulation has been passed that they thought wasn't necessary or they didn't think was the right regulation. So there are actually big problems with how Parliament and government is working with the regulators that mean that the strategic direction isn't necessarily clear enough, to be fair to the regulators, but then the regulators are going off in directions that are not properly checked and accountable, and that's some of the work that we're trying to do.
Can you
but
give us one example of that?
Okay, so let me talk about, okay, I've got a really good one. If we're talking about house building, it is a clear aim of the government to boost house building. And by all means, we can have a debate about where it is and the nature of it, but it's a clear aim and it's a big political thing. And I know James has a lot of experience in house building, and he, I'm sure, would agree that building more homes for younger people and for everybody is a good thing. But then you have, out of left field, Natural England, who then issue a directive to local councils. They're not a regulator of house builders, they're an environmental regulator. They issue a directive to local councils, which did not say you absolutely cannot do X. It said their guidance was that you shouldn't do X unless build new houses, unless certain questions about nutrient neutrality. And the local councils, understandably, got very scared about that and then effectively stopped a huge amount of house building. I won't say all house buildings, that's not quite right, but a huge amount of house building across the country. Now, it is a reasonable case to make that what they were doing is perfectly fine. Now, I happen to disagree, but I think you can say that, it's perfectly fine. But that was not, that is not what they are there for. They are not meant to have that sort of impact on a critical part of the economy and a critical part of government policy. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. The second point you were making about culture, I think is a very fair one, that culturally, and it's not just a British problem, I think in the West more generally, you are seeing more regulation, more risk-averse culture. But I'm afraid part of the job of politics is to say, you've got to lead, and you've got to say, look, we have a growth problem, we have an economic problem. In the 70s, when we had this problem, we didn't just say, oh, well, that's just the culture is the trade unions are very powerful, the culture is the economy's a bit rubbish, well, we'll just leave it. What did we do? Collectively as a country, and the Conservative Party and the Labour Party sort of caught up eventually with this, we changed a lot of those things, and I think that that's the job of politics.
James, from where we stand today, it seems that there is a half-decent chance that Labour might form the next government. If you agree with that assessment as to where we are regulatory, is it time? Does Labour think that it's time for a bonfire of the regulations?
That isn't what I said, though.
Sorry. I don't think that's what I said.
No, but it's no. Sorry, I don't want to be mean. But the reason why I pick up on that is because I want to be very, very clear. That is not what a good regulatory system looks like. A country with no regulation, right? You can have, there are lots in sub-Saharan Africa, right? There's no regulation, there's no government. They're not doing very well, yeah? I'm not talking about that. What I'm saying is we have got to have a system where the incentives are better for regulators and government and parliament to regulate in a smart way, clearly, that incentivizes growth and tips the balance back towards that rather than overemphasizing control and stifling of risk.
Understood. James.
Yeah, so the way I would see it is it's about understanding what the right role is for government to play, because ultimately the growth that we need in the economy will come from the private sector. That's where the innovation comes from, that's where the wealth creation comes from, that's where new jobs are largely going to come from. That's what we have to get right, and government has a role to play in creating the right environment for that growth to take place and for that growth to be as strong as possible. And that means that I think government has to play a role in making sure there are targeted interventions, whether that's public investment in particular new industries or in new things which need to be created to enable industries to flourish. It also means getting regulation right and making sure that some of the barriers to growth are pushed aside, are removed from being obstacles to that growth, which is one reason why Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer talk so much about planning, reform at the Labour Party conference. Planning, I think we all know in the UK, planning can be a real barrier to growth, not just housing, but also to infrastructure and other things that we need to be building in this country. So getting the regulation, getting the planning system, getting the whole environment right is crucial. Making sure that I think government should be an active partner with the private sector to make sure that government is supporting private industry to grow and to expand into new sectors of the future. But I think the one other thing I would say is that when I sit down with businesses across all sorts of different sectors and start the conversation, what are you looking for in a government? The importance of stability and certainty always comes up. That universally across all different sectors, stability and certainty, predictability, is something which is so highly valued. And, actually that in a way doesn't cost anything. A government can be stable and can provide certainty, but it's worth a huge amount to those people who are choosing whether to invest and where to invest and how to grow the economy. So for us, that kind of stability and certainty, respecting for economic institutions, setting out, our plans for what we want to do with the economy, not changing target dates, later on when companies have already made investment decisions. All of that, I think, is really important to providing the right environment for that investment and that growth in the private sector.
Shankar, how would you say Britain has compared for stability in recent years?
Well, before I get onto that, can I just respond to a couple of these points that have been made? So first of all, I agree that and we need to get away from this discussion about deregulation and bonfire regulation, that kind of thing, because there will be, reasonable people will disagree about the precise regulatory framework that is needed in a particular area, and we don't want to. I don't want to minimise those disagreements because we're having a big disagreement about deregulation versus no regulation. What we're essentially saying versus too much regulation. What you want is regulation that is the least distortive of your trade and competition in the market, consistent with a legitimate regulatory purpose. And that statement is a very difficult statement to unpack by a regulator. And I think the issue we have with regulators is we want them independent from political interference, and that's the right thing to do. They shouldn't be influenced unduly by political interference. But the problem is, by making them independent of politics, we kind of made them independent of any kind of principle. And what I think does need to happen is there does need to be a set of regulatory principles that they are actually bound to. And the statement I made is, I think, a statement of principle in terms of what they should be guided by. And the problem that Bim alluded to is a problem of a process. It's the role of the statutory consultees in the planning process, which is completely without any kind of, it's not moored to any kind of principle. The local councils are therefore terrified of being judicially reviewed because of the statements made by statutory consultees. The result of this is it takes an enormous length of time to do anything in the UK, to build anything in the UK, much longer than continental Europe, much longer than the US, much longer than most other countries. And it's much more expensive to do anything in the UK, largely because of that planning process. So you're absolutely right, James, about planning is a massive barrier to economic growth in the UK. And we need to reform these systems. But I think the way to reform them is to have a set of principles in place that we all sort of agree with. And these are not principles that are particularly political. In fact, the OECD, the International Competition Network, these international agencies have all said that kind of competition assessment of regulation is what you need to be going after.
But principles, one thing, principles hit realities when, particularly in planning circumstances, when they start becoming reality, don't they? Whether you're building a nuclear power station, a high-speed rail line, or just houses on the green belt, perhaps, there is an impingement on somebody's rights or somebody's perception of their rights. And democracy is nothing if not a guarantee of due process. So where can we simplify process to make it more effective?
Shankar mentioned something that I would say I'd urge everybody to think about, but I don't want everybody to have a headache. It's judicial review. If you go back through, and Shankar's 25 years as a very eminent lawyer, if you go back even 30 years, let alone 50, the opportunity to judicial review a decision was much more limited than it is today. And I don't think 50 years ago we were living in a totalitarian state last time I checked. So what has happened over time, and again, this isn't like the act of some like evil, nefarious sort of mastermind, but over time, there's been this mission creep, which has meant that every year courts have become more and more involved in what used to be the province of politics. And when that happens too much, you now get a situation where the most common thing said in Whitehall or Westminster is, oh gosh, we might get judicial reviewed for that. Or should we do that? That might lead to a judicial review. And so it inhibits even before the thing has happened. Do you see what I mean? It's not just when the judicial review happens, it's the whole culture. And unless we deal with this, then this will continue to get worse and worse and worse. And so it's really, really important that, and part of this, I do blame the courts to some degree, but they're not the entire, it's not entirely their fault. It's a willingness within the culture of Whitehall and Westminster to accept that, not to legislate clearly and properly to exclude those instances where it's a grey area, so to speak. And there are lots of other things that we just need to do and focus on.
James, would a Labour government put more restrictions on the scope for judicial review?
Well, actually, in the plans that Rachel set out at Labour Party conference around planning, the role of judicial review of legal challenge was one of the points that she mentioned. And I think, it sits alongside a whole range of ways in which we need to improve the planning system, both in terms of giving, more certainty and more strength behind certain policy objectives, not just in terms of housing, but also in terms of infrastructure. And there's also the question of capacity in terms of planning departments across the country and decisions just not being taken quickly enough to enable development to happen at pace. So we set out how we would use certain revenue from stamp duty to fund extra planning officers in planning capacity in departments. So it's not like there's just one switch you can flick to make the planning system work. But I think having that greater certainty around what the policy objectives are, making sure that you've got a system where it doesn't get snarled up, and making sure that you've got the capacity to actually take those decisions, I think then that starts looking like a planning system which is supporting an ambitious growth agenda.
Are you anywhere near agreeing a language internally on what that should mean in a manifesto?
Well, you will see in the manifesto.
When he was talking about predictability and certainty, you got that right there.
I'll just take this opportunity to remind you that we are inviting questions from the audience. You can enter them via the Swapcard app, and I'll try and keep some time back for that. I'll be able to monitor them here as they come in. In the meantime, one of the topics that politicians obviously don't want to pick open, but I'm going to do it anyway because my life was really badly disrupted, and I know a lot of people that I know had their lives badly disrupted by this. With Brexit, we have introduced, I think, that was the cause of a lot of the instability that we've just been talking about. This has necessarily caused a huge and disruptive transition in our legislative arrangements. So would you all agree that so far it has not delivered the benefits that we would have expected or hoped for? And how can specifically the Brexit-related disruption, whether it's on access to our neighbours' markets or on labour migration and addressing the shortcomings of the labour force, how can we address these in the next Parliament?
I mean, I'll leave the second part of your question to Shankar, who does, who is working on this right now. But just on the first point, I would just say, I think people need to conceive and conceptualize Brexit in a different way from how you've done it. it is fundamentally a constitutional question that has had various other impacts. That means that those with effectively more freedom in the constitutional question, that has meant, to be frank, that we've been exposed in certain areas where we have been weak, but it has also exposed those areas of real strength. Now, the trick of politics and government is to say, the areas where we're weak, how do we get them up? How do we improve them? And the areas where we're strong, how do we stay strong? And that's just taking some time to work through. It hasn't been helped by the political chaos over the last few years, but that was only partly Brexit related. That's, internal Conservative Party sort of psychodrama. But, practically, we have all the levers that we need. The debate between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is who's going to best show the public that we're going to use the levers in the right way. And that's the debate that we'll be having over the next year, running into the general election.
What would be your starting point now? What would you most advance?
Well, I think, as I talked about regulatory reform, a big part of that agenda is connected with leaving the European Union. So let's take the CMA, which is a regulator that I'm, frankly think have made a lot of mistakes over recent months. The CMA used to be effectively a subordinate regulator to the European competition regulator. Now they find themselves effectively operating at the same level, though the European regulator regulates a bigger market. Now, we are going to have to update. We are doing so with the Digital Markets Bill that's coming through the House, though I think in certain aspects that needs to be changed, but that's a separate point. That process is part of updating how the CMA is going to operate in this country and its relationship with other competition authorities. That we would not be having that discussion had it not been for leaving the European Union, right? So the European Union is quite integral. Leaving the European Union is quite integral to the whole question of regulatory reform and how we frame our system.
Shankar.
So I agree that constitutional settlements change, from time to time when the people want them, and this is what has happened. And the question that you asked is basically how do you maximise the opportunities and minimise the disruptions. So essentially there are three things that you have to do well. One, you have to take full advantage of the trade opportunity that you have with regard to external trade and the independence of your trade policy. That relates to your own trade regime and your own trade openness, but also the benefits you can get externally for your exporters. And I think the government, I would say, has done many of the right things in that area. If I were to give them
such as?
Well, the accession to the CPTPP would not have been possible otherwise. The trade deals you saw with Australia, we could do a trade deal with Australia. The European deal with Australia has created, for obvious reasons, to do with European agricultural domestic baggage. So there's many things. There's US MOUs and so forth, and we are in a reasonable position, I think, to get ultimately a US trade deal and so on. So that I think is less. They've done more. They're closer to a good result there. Then you've got two other things where I think we're probably further away from a good result. One is domestic regulatory reform. What do you do to improve your own domestic regulation based on the fact you're now in control of it? There we've seen very little progress, to be quite frank. There's been some recently in the case of financial services, but there could be a lot more. And then the third area is how do you minimise the disruptions? How do you manage your border as best you can? And I think, there's some good things that have been happening in terms of things like a single commitment, at least, to a single trade window, the border target operating model, efforts to move from a hazard-based system of controls in certain areas to more of a risk-based system, things that are designed to try to improve your sort of customs processes and so on. I mean, efforts are being made to do that. Have we done that particularly well? I don't think so. And then related to that is the trade agreement that we have with the European Union. What can we do to improve the access there? And I think, frankly, the Windsor framework has opened up that discussion. and it's enabled us now to have a better conversation with the European Union. And what do we want there? We want more mutual recognition. We want some of these types of things. I don't mean in financial services. I mean mainly in goods markets. And I think they are more open to this than they perhaps have been in the past. So, trade agreements are living things. They change. They are built on over time. And the EU-UK TCA has a series of specialised and joint committees designed to improve the agreement. So we need to push that on. That's not, that does not undercut in any way your external trade policy agenda. And I would argue that one of the problems I think we've done in the UK in the past is we've separated the EU-UK trade arrangements from the rest of our trade policy, which doesn't make any sense at all. We should have a single integrated trade policy.
If I may, Shekhar, the statistics are quite clear that trade as a share of GDP has fallen since Brexit. That's the Bank of England governor himself was yesterday saying that this has reduced the openness of the UK economy. It's one of the things that has contributed to us having higher inflation than the rest of Europe or of the United States. If Brexit was supposed to deliver greater openness, when is it going to happen?
Yes, I'm not sure I agree with that
well, the figures are what they are, Shane.
Well, but if you look at the trade, within the European Union, when the UK was a part of the European Union, trade within the European Union, when it was a single market customs union that we were part of, was declining as a percentage of overall UK trade. So you would imagine that where things are very open, trade would be increasing. It wasn't increasing because actually what's happening in the world is where the trade opportunities are, and everyone is looking at the US, the Europeans, the UK, we're all looking at the Indo-Pacific. That's where the trade growth is fastest, and that's where our trade future really is. So the question you're asking is, have we taken advantage of our abilities to be more open? And there I would agree with you. We haven't taken advantage of those. And in many areas, we are being more closed. Bim mentioned the CMA. The CMA's decision in Microsoft Activision was the most extreme, I would argue, anti-competitive decision of either the US or the European Union or any other regulator. So just because you have the freedom to be more open doesn't mean you will use it. And I have colleagues in the IEA actually who I voted Remain, but who basically said we will not be able to use the freedom that Brexit will give us in a positive way. We will, for reasons that Bim has outlined in the past. We will use it to be more closed, to actually be less trade open than the EU. Now, I don't agree with that. I think we
must bring James in. He's starting to. James, how would Labour do Brexit better?
Yeah, well, look, I think the phrasing you use there is right, because at the last general election, the slogan which we all heard was get Brexit done. I think now we're into a make Brexit work phase of this. We have set out from our point of view what our red lines are in terms of things that we won't change. We accept we're out of the single market, out of the customs union, out of freedom of movement, and then within those red lines, what can we do to make Brexit work? I think a lot of this comes down to the unglamorous but essential part of government, which is rolling up the sleeves and having hard graft and negotiation with the European Union to make sure that when it's in our national interest, we are reducing things that hamper our economic growth. And I think there's not one switch you can do to make Brexit work. This is about hard work. It's not about grandstanding, but it is about having that constructive relationship to make sure that we can reduce those barriers where they are impacting on our national economy in our national interest.
How would you specifically address the labour market issue? I mean, there doesn't seem to be, the literature does seem fairly conclusive that losing that freedom of movement within the EU has deprived the UK labour force of a lot of skills, and that the skills mismatch in the economy has got worse as a result. What scope do you see, and Bim, what scope do you see for fixing specifically that part of the UK economy which is not working well at the moment?
So
No, you
so I think that one issue about how our country works when it comes to immigration and skills are that the two systems of the immigration system and the skills and training system are seen as separate. And what we want to effect, if we were lucky enough to be in government, is to have an immigration system that works with the skills system. So if you have greater immigration driven by a shortage of certain particular skills, that should send a message to your skills and training sector that we need to invest in making sure that people in the UK have those skills and have that training so that they can do those jobs. So the two systems should work together to make sure that if you are having immigration for a particular skills shortage, that should send a message to your skills and training sector. That's something we need to focus on. I think the other thing, I won't go into all the detail because of time, but the other thing is about long-term sickness and people being unwell and the impact that's having on the labour market, which is connected to all sorts of things, not least of which is the NHS. But that's also another thing about getting more people in the UK back into the labour market.
Then I promise.
Look, I think what James said about matching up immigration and skills makes sense. Driving down long-term sick, I was actually talking to Mel Stride, the Work and Pension Secretary, the other day about the work he's doing on that, and I think that he's moving in the right direction on those. The thing I'd add, though, is what's interesting is if you look at our immigration number, our net migration and our gross total migration numbers, it's pretty high. We already have a match for skills, so there's a list of skills that we need, and that gets changed from time to time, and we're recruiting lots of people to do that. So you're sort of thinking it's very odd. You've got a labour market problem, almost full employment, and high immigration. These three things shouldn't really all be true at the same time. I think a big part of it is the economy adjusting to the different types of people. So, for example, if you go back to the early 2000s, the stereotypical Polish plumber, right? Why were they coming over? Everybody focuses on the free movement aspect, and it'd be wrong to deny that because it's easy just to get on a plane, that wasn't part of it. But the biggest part of it was money. That Polish plumber in Poland couldn't make nearly as much money in Poland as he could in Britain. Since then, Poland partly has become a richer country. The exchange rates have equalized. So it no longer makes nearly as much sense for the Polish plumber to be here. That's not actually, they're not really it's not that we're obstructing people who want to come here and be builders. It's because in his own country, comparatively, there isn't so much of a gap. Now, that's an economic thing that wasn't per se down to Brexit, by the way. It would have happened, I think, anyway. And so what are we replacing that person with? We are getting more people from my heritage, Nigerian heritage. We're getting way more Nigerians, Indians, Chinese, Koreans, various other people coming to the country more than we did in the past. I don't think inherently it's worse to have a Nigerian than a Pole, but I do also think that the Nigerian or the Indian might have different skills than the Poles having. So I think that what you're seeing is, I just think you're seeing the economy having to adjust to the different types of person coming in, and looking at the numbers in and of itself can be a bit misleading. So I think that we're just going through a period of adjustment that I think will end up okay in the coming years.
Is that a fair assessment, Shankar?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you can do in the context of the UK-EU agreement is, and I think the Europeans are becoming more open to these kinds of conversations now, which is mode 4 services, and looking at how we deal with mobility issues where there are businesses in the UK that have a need for a particular type of worker, that we can actually agree liberalisation in those areas in the context of the EU-UK TCA. We've just agreed mobility agreements with the Australians and the New Zealanders. We can agree these types of things. We can have sensible needs-based, immigration policies. But I think Bim is right about one thing, which is the demographics and the economics of immigration are changing, and that's nothing to do with trade agreements and so on, and trade arrangements. And I think what we're going to have to do is you have to have a needs-based system, and you have to maximise your liberalisation of, and it's not free movement. It's a trade concept of movement of natural persons in a trade agreement. Where the EU-UK agreement is weak is in services, and that could be improved. And you have to have that as your base construct, and then you're more able to deal with these demographic changes, and you're more able to deal with these economic changes. But they're coming regardless of whatever we say or do in the trade sort of world.
Now, demographics, of course, is destiny, famously. What you've spoken of, James, particularly, and Bim, in getting the skills training, that is going to require public sector money up to a point. You have, whoever wins the next election is going to face some tremendous fiscal challenges. 170 billion has to be paid to the Bank of England alone over the next decade. And you're running out of fiscal space for the traditional stimulative measures that past governments have relied on. How are you going to cope with that lack of fiscal space going forward?
Yeah, well, look, we're absolutely clear that any pledges we make are fully costed and fully funded. And I think one of the important things about our approach to the plans that we're starting to set out, and it will be a plan that you'll see in our manifesto, is that actually reform is a crucial element of what we would want to do if we were in government. You know, this is, as I said earlier, it's not about the tax and spend lever, it's about the growth lever, but it's also about not just saying, well, you know, what money can go into a system. It's about saying, how can you reform a system to make it work better? So when you think about the skills and training system, you know, how can you reform that? How can you give control locally to local authorities, combined authorities, to work out what skills are needed in an area? How can you strengthen the connections between government, local government, and businesses to make sure the right skills are being provided for? You know, how can you make sure that college education is targeted in the right way for what the skills needs are in a local area? There's a huge amount of reform you can do there, which doesn't involve extra money being spent, but does involve reforming the system. And I think whether you apply that to the skills system or to everything we want to do to, you know, the NHS or to other public sector services, I think that focus on reform is going to be really crucial for us going into the next election.
Okay, thank you. Now, I have had a technological glitch, so I haven't been able to register your questions until just now. And I think that's my problem rather than anybody else's. I do apologise. We have time for one question, for which I'll direct to Bim first. Why has audit reform been kicked into the long grass 5 years on from the collapse of Carillion?
I think it's important that if we are going to reform the corporate governance code, and audit reform isn't part of that, that we are competitive when you look at when you look internationally. And a lot of the proposals, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of those proposals were much more stringent on public companies than you see in our competitive countries. So, you know, you can do all the reform you like and make it harder and more onerous for someone to be a director, for example, of a public company. Fine. But we shouldn't then be surprised if people don't want to become directors of public companies, or indeed if companies don't want to go public, and then we complain that the London Stock Exchange doesn't get enough IPOs. So I frankly think that we should be we already have huge amounts of not just regulation, but duties and real responsibilities, legal responsibilities on directors of public companies. They are very heavy. To make them even heavier is, I think, a very big decision, and I'm glad that we're not doing so.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I see that we've overrun just ever so slightly. I have to wind up here. So there we are. Judicial review and mission creep. Roll it back. That is the priority for the next government. And make Brexit work better. There's no going back, so we can only go forward. Please stay seated. We're going straight into the next panel. The next panel, it is actually an interview between our Senior Finance Editor, Isabella Kaminska, and City Minister, Andrew Griffith. All that remains for me to do is thank you very much for your attention and to invite you to show your appreciation for our panellists. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
easier now. There's only 2 chairs. Sorry. It's a little easier now. There's only 2 chairs.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Victoria, for, I feel like the pregnant lady should not be doing stage management, but it's a workplace accident waiting to happen, but we'll ignore it. I'm Isabella Kaminska. I'm the Senior Finance Editor at Politico, and I'm very delighted to have joining us right now in an exclusive interview, I hope, Andrew Griffith, who is the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and I believe just off a plane from New York. So how are you feeling?
Feeling good, Isabella.